Well, we're here in Vancouver, British Columbia, at the University of British Columbia, UBC, and specifically at Green College, which I think is the graduate college.
That's right.
Here. And I'm so pleased to be joined here by Jenny Penberthy. Hi, Jenny.
Hello.
It's great to see you. I think we might be meeting for the first
time. I think so. Yeah.
Although we've swirled around each other at MLAs in the past.
We've met many times by email.
Virtually and by email, yes.
Yeah.
And Karis Shearer, who came west from Kelowna to join us. And since we're talking about place, and place is really important to the poem we're about to discuss, I think it might be appropriate to do a land acknowledgement.
Yeah, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered today to talk about this poem on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And so I think that's kind of locates us, and it is a privilege to work and do this conversation on the territory.
Thank you. So we're talking about a poem by Lorine Niedecker, Linnaeus in Lapland. And I think we've agreed that Karis would read it. I'm tempted to have it read twice. Maybe Jenny will read it a second time so the sound of the words is in our head. And then we'll talk about it really without plan. The great thing about this is that I'm almost tempted to hold up Jenny's copy of it. There are no notes on the copy. There's some other notes behind. But the great thing about these conversations is that we're not going to try to go phrase by phrase, line by line in order. We're just going to talk about it. And in the process of talking about it improvisationally, a lot will come out. So I'm looking forward to this. Karis, you want to read it once through?
Sure. Linnaeus in Lapland. Nothing worth noting except an Andromeda, with quadrangle shoots, the boots of the people. Wet inside, they must swim to church through the floods or be taxed, the blossoms from the bosoms of the leaves.
Jenny?
Linnaeus in Lapland. Nothing worth noting except an Andromeda with quadrangular shoots, the boots of the people wet inside. They must swim to church through the floods or be taxed, the blossoms from the bosoms of the leaves.
I hadn't planned on starting this way, but I'm drawn whenever Niedecker does this. She sets us off at the beginning by saying there's nothing worth noticing, and then the accept begins to notice. Either of you want to comment on that rhetorical strategy? It's witty and clever.
Well, it's in the case of this poem, it's Linnaeus who's the one who's actually saying nothing worth noting, and she's quoting him, and of course she's fascinated by the fact that he says there's nothing worth noting except something utterly extraordinary.
Right, the galaxy.
So she's delighted by that kind of proximity.
Yeah. Karis, as a reader, what happens to you when you read a poem which does a bit of a sleight of hand logically?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that first line for me invokes that kind of terra nullius of, an explorer looking and finding nothing, right? Which happened in Canada a lot. Those explorers who arrived and assumed that there was nothing here, and therefore, colonization happened. And I hear an echo of that here too, right? There's nothing here, and yet there is, and that follows with that kind of beautiful emphasis.
Mm-hmm. An Andromeda. So, Jenny, it's not a particular reference to the phenomenon, the astronomical phenomenon. We feel it to be a metaphor of a kind of shape, yes?
Well, it's the name of a plant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Andromeda. And it's a plant that Linnaeus named himself. So he encountered this unusual plant, and this one in particular with the quadrangular shoots, and he named it. And what, this poem is drawn from her reading of Linnaeus's journals that he wrote in the course of his journey through Lapland. If you're interested, I could read you the sections from the journal.
Yes, I think if you can do that, that would be great, because we're going to need some help figuring out how we go from the shoots, which are descriptive, to the boots of the people.
Indeed, yeah. I had the good fortune to go looking for the Lapland journal after it had been digitized. So it was digitized.
That's helpful.
Yeah, really. It was digitized about 10 years ago. And so I was able to find the exact passages that she drew.
May I ask if she read all this, and
I suspect so, yeah.
these few lines came from it, or are there other? Wow. So this is a radical condensation of the experience of reading and thinking, and then we have this.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, one of the questions is, why did she choose these particular passages? You know, I mean, it is a beautiful piece of writing, this whole 700-page journal, and you can see why Dahlberg was urging her to read it.
Jenny, are you saying that many of these phrases come from?
Direct from the journal, yeah.
So it's a collage of Linnaeus. Did she do this often?
Oh yeah, all the time.
But you know, like sort of Marianne Moore, that much?
Yeah.
How come we didn't know this?
Oh, you didn't?
I mean, you know, you read it. This is somewhat more disjunctive than a lot of her poems, but I read them and I imagine Lorine in Wisconsin doing, you know, that they're from her life and so forth. This is really an important education. Would you quote from the journal, and then I want to go back to the title?
Yeah. So, you know, she's done the quote, she uses the journal differently, even within this tiny little poem. Mm-hmm. So the section of the journal where he talks about the Andromeda, she uses that word for word, although she's selecting her words from his passage. Mm-hmm. And then the part about the people having to swim to church, that she rewords. So it's kind of interesting to see how she manipulates each of those sections of the journal.
So she's made something of an implicit story or incident out of it by bringing pieces together from the journal that were
the story is in the journal, right? But she's phrased it slightly differently for the purposes of the poem.
Give us a taste of these.
Yeah, so I'll give you maybe first the Andromeda section, and this comes from the second volume of the two of the Tour in Lapland is the English translation of the title. Nothing occurred particularly worth noticing by the way, except an Andromeda, tetragona, with quadrangular shoots and flowers from the bosoms of the leaves.
You nailed it.
There we are, right.
And because it was digital, you were able to search. You didn't have to read the darn thing.
Yeah, that one
That's
really
big
came
help.
up easily. I had to struggle to find the other one. I mean, I had to read a lot of journal to find the other one. So I'll read you the other one. So this is the wet boots one. And this comes from the first volume. The poor Laplanders find the church festivals or days of public thanksgiving in the spring of the year very burthensome and oppressive, as they are in general obliged to pass the river at the hazard of their lives. The water at that season is neither sufficiently frozen to bear them, nor open enough to be navigated, so they are under the necessity of wading frequently up to their arms, and are half dead with cold and fatigue by the time they get to church. They must either undergo this hardship or be fined $10 silver and do penance for 3 Sundays, which is surely too severe.
Fined for being absent from church.
Yeah. So we get this extraordinary condensation of that
right.
in the.
So Karis, you have just been there's a revelation here about process. So I wonder if I could ask you a question of you as a reader of the poem. So what I took, because I'm an idiot about the relationship to the journal, what I took as a disjunctive move from the plant to the story of the church. It's still disjunctive because she takes it from different parts of the journal. So how did you read it before hearing Jenny tell us about the source? Or what are the differences? And how do you feel as a reader critic
Sure, yeah.
being informed thus?
So yeah, I also had no idea about the journals as a context, and I guess as you were reading, I was thinking about really the difference between prose and poetry, and where she's kind of finding but also constructing some of the sound, the kind of hinges between shoots and boots, and the connections between those sounds are Andromeda. And I was sort of trying to listen for, whether she's hearing that in the journals or whether she's drawing those sounds out and creating and rendering poetic, how she renders poetic.
I'm excited to think about the relationship to the journal and to the decision, which you've reconstructed, of picking out passages from different parts of the journal, a big journal, such that shoots would lead to boots. Those are from two different passages. So the hinge is not narrative. We have to do the work to figure out what the narrative is, the relationship between the plant, the description of the plant, and these people going to church. The relation starts out, I'm going to say randomly, and I don't mean that, but randomly, because of Boots' shoots, I assume. We have to assume that. She went and found Boots. She thought, well, I've just left off at shoots, put a dash there. But I still am interested, and I'd like to ask both of you, as readers, close readers, how we get from the description of the plant to the story of the people. How do you, not knowing about the notebook, how do you read the poem? Is it a scene in which these two things happen? Is there a story in the disjunction? Karis, would you start? How would you have read this had Jenny not been here to tell us about the notebooks?
Okay. It's hard to not know that now.
Yes, really. It's too late. It's too late. For anybody watching this discussion, thankfully, it's too late to think of Niedecker as writing a lyric poem in which she jumps from something to another.
I guess, for me, one of the questions was like, who are the people, right? And it seems to me that they're the Laplanders, or the Sami people, as we call them now. And they're going to church, which is not, I think, out of their culture. And so one of the things that Shoots and Boots does is it, does it tie them or reconnect them, bring them to the land, right? To the, connect them organically to the place.
Wet boots, certainly, Jenny, makes us think that one could be tromping around and observing flowers, and naturally wet boots of the people, which is a loaded leftist-ish term.
Very deliberately the people, in its leftish connotation. And it's such a strong rhyme, that Shoots and Boots, and also it's such a strong placement in the sentence, where, in terms of the syntax, there we've got this little kind of narrative about the people that is positioned in apposition, right? It's the most extraordinary thing that she's done, really. It's like this little tiny narrative is there to kind of enlarge on what she's saying about the plants, right? If you think of how an apposition would typically work, it's explaining what's come before. So, that is kind of extraordinary.
I'll say.
Yeah. One of the things with that journal that is very striking is how he is both the botanist and the anthropologist. So he talks about the Laplanders, the Sami people, very, very steadily through the whole journal.
And thinks of it as part of his job of observation generally?
Well, this is a journal.
Right, okay.
You know, it's
this is not his science.
It's a personal journal. He was emphatic about not wanting it published. And so it was published after his death and without his permission. And it's very much just his daily observations.
Right.
And that is, of course, the kind of material that Niedecker is so drawn to.
It's her project. Sorry to use that word project, but it is her project, right? To think about the the environment around her, especially when she's in solitude, and then all the social facts that intrude upon it, and back and forth all the time.
Yeah.
If I may, the structure of this thing is section dash section. There's a colon, we'll leave that alone because it continues. Section dash 1, 2, 3. 1, natural observation. 2, social anthropological observation. 3, seemingly back to natural with the bosoms as a figure connecting us to 2. So you could say that there is a reconciliation of the two worlds in the 3rd section, or you could say, let's just say she's returning to the natural.
There are reasons why she would have chosen this little swimming through the floods as little tiny story, partly because, of course, she herself lived on a floodplain, and she knew the experience of wet boots all too well. So that one can make sense of her choice of that passage from the journal.
Right.
But what do we do with the other choice? Yes, she's drawn to his modesty. He didn't see anything worth noting except a completely extraordinary plant with quadrangular shoots. But I suspect that she was quite taken with this account of flowers from the bosoms of the leaves. I mean, it is kind of weird language, right?
It's Linnaeus' language, his figuration.
Yeah, it's his. And can I read you then a little, just go back to that journal entry,
Sure, yeah.
and then read you the next sentence that follows it. Nothing occurred particularly worth noticing by the way, except an Andromeda, tetragona, with quadrangular shoots and flowers from the bosoms of the leaves. The stem is woody, procumbent, naked, thread-shaped, variously divided. Branches partly erect, entirely covered with leaves. Flower stalks solitary from the bosoms of the leaves, erect, thread-shaped, each bearing a drooping flower.
Wow.
What strikes me in this passage, and that has me wondering about Niedecker's choice of it, is the sexual language, what would surely have struck her as you know, so we get the bosoms of the leaves, then we get the naked branches,
and the erect.
and we get the erect branches, and again the flower stalks now erect, and again the bosoms of the leaves, right, twice mentioned. And he does, when you read, I haven't read the entire 700 pages, but I read a few, quite a few. And he does, and especially in his account of his naming of the Andromeda plant, he comes across as this kind of prissy male botanist, right? And I think she finds this language irresistible and kind of hilarious. I think it's a funny poem, which is a kind of, I'm sort of open to dispute of that point, because it had always struck me as a slightly chilly poem, and one that was a little forbidding and tricky to enter, right? And now I'm starting to see it as a poem that has some layers of humor.
Karis, let me turn to you. If it's got an ironic and humored stance, how do we deal with the middle section of these poor people having to swim to get to church or be taxed?
Yeah, I mean, which is not funny at all.
Right. So So how do you read it? I guess I'm asking again how someone who's new to Niedecker or new to this kind of Niedecker, how do you read this thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two levels to that, right? I mean, there's this sort of almost mythical. I mean, I think I misread it when I first came to the poem, because I was like, oh, they must swim to church. Like, that's figurative language, and of course it's not, right? It's
they're literally swimming to church.
They are literally
bizarre.
swimming to church, right? And I think
in this cold water.
Yeah.
Crazy, or be taxed.
You know, obviously that was a mistake to kind of read it at that level initially, but I think it as poetic language, it invites us to kind of wonder, or think, or maybe go there to start with, and it's like, oh no, that's actually, and so I think the tension maybe between those two, the reading and misreading, is there some comedy in that? Is there, does it invite us to misread and then deliver the more documentary, really tragic and horrifying image?
I guess I would, as a follow-up to that, and I'd love your thoughts on this, Jenny. I think of Lorine Niedecker as one of the great observers in modern poetry. This is a poem about someone else observing. She's really brilliantly playing. Usually it's a Niedecker-like speaker, or often it's a Niedecker-like speaker who's doing the observing. Here, she's observing someone the way he observes.
Yes, and I think it is more often than we realize. She is using somebody else's observations.
Right.
And interestingly, this poem that is drawing on Linnaeus's observations nevertheless strikes us as a quintessential Niedecker poem, right? And yet the words are somebody else's.
Right. Amazing.
Aside from the middle section, which is a paraphrase, really.
Right.
But that is something kind of extraordinary about a lot of her work, that vast numbers of the poems use other people's voices. But remarkably, the poems sound like her.
But it makes her nonetheless, in our view, someone who is really concerned with observation and with seeing. In fact, all the more, probably.
I guess my final thought is this has brought me around to thinking about Linnaeus as a kind of poet, but also the way in which, the passages that you read. Al, you asked me about, the humor. I mean, it's almost absurd, in the way that he embellishes and sexualizes the, he's trying to get at something in language, and he's almost trying to render it poetically. And what she does is she brings that, and she does render it poetically, right?
Yeah.
She brings what is, not quite poetic language, but finds something in it and renders that in a poem, and I think it's so beautiful.
Okay, I have a final thought, and then we'll back to you, Jenny, for a final thought. I'm attracted to the middle section and the phrase "the people," which we've talked about, and the anti-taxation stance that's implicit in the journal entry and explicit if you know Niedecker. Not explicit here, but just generally, you feel certain that she's feeling an affinity for that problem. And I love the idea of a scientific, naturalist, observationist, general context is grounded by what is essentially a populist, the people, a populist stance. And if one can find no other connection to the first and third sections of the description of the plant, other than that, there's no such thing as an objective botanist. There's no such thing as botany without journal feelings, right? It's almost as if she's glad she found the journal rather than just the botany, because she wants to have that populist attitude toward the environment around her. And that's, to me, that's so important in Niedecker, and I take very seriously her affinity with the wet people. Having to sit in church.
Yeah, really.
Jenny, final thought?
Yeah, well, maybe to go back to her her use of other voices in her poems, and yeah, there was that wonderful comment that she made in a letter to Jonathan Williams, where she said, "I'm a different character in a different drama with every poem that I write." And I think that's useful for this one. She's adopting Linnaeus's voice. She's using his voice, and the poem is a fascinating little drama in a
dramatic
in
monologue,
a way.
really, right?
Yeah, and I was thinking of you, Karis, and your work, and of course you, Al, with the extraordinary Pen Sound archive. And I actually went back to listen to the Niedecker, the one and only recording of Niedecker reading.
The one that Corman made in 1970 or something like that.
That's right, yeah. And I listened again to that, and my previous exposure to that always made me think it was a sort of fumbled and slightly embarrassed performance, but I felt quite differently this time, and I thought, well, yes, when you get the non-performing Niedecker in a few moments in that recording, yes, she is embarrassed and giggly and shy.
Right.
But the minute she reads the poems, and particularly the poems that use somebody else's voice, when she's reading the Jefferson poem, the Darwin poem, the William Morris, she's very animated. She is completely inside that voice. She's in the drama of the voice.
Karis, we were supposed to stop after that, but Jenny has teed it up for you about the importance of voice not being just the metaphor of,
Sure.
of 1960s era creative writing workshops. You need your own voice. Actual voice, Jenny is observing that the dramatic voice, the othered voice, is where Lorine Niedecker, the person, is less embarrassed, shy. Yeah. So do you want to observe about the importance of the recorded voice and how it gets us closer rather than further away from the poet?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things we hear, especially in recordings where we have like the reading of the poem, but we also have this sort of extra poetic voice of the introduction. You said, giggly, nervous, and somehow that's like a less comfortable state than it is to be in the, voicing the poem itself, right? And I think that's often there's a tension between those two modes of, narrating introduction in the poem. And it's interesting that, of course, she seems to be more comfortable in not only the poem, but in another voice, right? In that kind of, is it a projection almost, or a projection of the self into another voice? Yeah.
But even in a poem that's supposedly her voice, her position, subject position, such as foreclosure, which is in the same thing. When we get quotes in there, or phrases maybe that the foreclosing bank people would use, the sudden strength comes out. Too bad she didn't record this poem.
Well, and one thing that I think is important about her use of other voices and other texts is that it provides her with, and this is another way of saying what you've just said, Karis, it provides her with some distance from the self. And
Right.
this was a crucial element of her poetics,
Right.
Was to look for ways to erase the self.
Right.
And so how
Right.
better, than to use an entirely different person's
Right.
language and
Right.
voice.
Right.
Yeah.
This has been so good and fun. Thank you both for spending the time. Jenny,
you.
thank you for coming by on this snowy day here in Vancouver, slippery, slidey day. And
Sure.
Karis, you slided all the way from parts to the east of here. Thank you very much. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Al.
Thank you.